Andrea Stanley and Lindsay Barr join me this week to discuss malt sensory analysis. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 170. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 170, and it's early May 2018. This week, Andrea Stanley and Lindsay Barr join me to discuss malt sensory analysis. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running a great deal right now. Get 20% off your subscription when you use the code BeerSmith2018. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for home brewers and beer lovers. And you can read my new column called Ask the Experts. Take advantage of their special deal now and use the offer code BeerSmith2018 at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the new BrewVision thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud and set updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. It includes all the tools you need to create recipes on the go, share them with your friends, and act as a pocket brew timer. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on the Google Play, iTunes, or Amazon app stores. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Andrea Stanley and Lindsay Barr. Andrea is co-founder of Valley Malting Malt House up in Massachusetts, and Lindsay Barr is a sensory specialist at New Belgium Brewing in Colorado. Today they join us to discuss malt sensory analysis. It's great to have you guys on the show. Welcome back, Andrea. You've been on twice before, I think.
Yes.
It's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back.
And Lindsay, I think you're a first-time guest, right?
Indeed. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you guys both on the show. And you're talking about, I think, a presentation you did recently, right, Andrea?
Yeah, we had an opportunity this year to do a presentation on malt sensory and flavor at the Craft Brewers Conference in Nashville, which was just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago. Well, Andrea, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about the malt sensory analysis. Can you tell us about what is going on in the craft beer industry and how it's driving some of the interest in malt flavors?
Sure. Well, part of the reason why we were asked to speak at the Craft Brewers Conference is, believe it or not, craft brewers really care about malt, and they care about the flavor that they are able to or not to get from their malt. And a lot has been going on since 2014 when the Craft Brewers Association wrote a white paper about characteristics of malt for craft brewers. And in that white paper, there was a lot of really interesting information from some surveys that the Brewers Association had done. And it showed that there were some gaps that had been identified by craft brewers about their current malt supply. And the biggest gap was flavor, that craft brewers really wanted to have more flavor in their base malts. They wanted to understand more about what drove flavor, and really to have conversations with each other and with their maltsters about malt and malt flavor.
Well,
and
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Just to continue on that gap was identified, and then there were some bridges to that gap that were also identified. And one of those was that there didn't exist a method to analyze malt flavor and aroma. And that's something that Lindsay, your guest here, helped to develop along with Cassie from from Brice.
Very cool. And Lindsay, you're a malt sensory specialist. I'm sorry, you're a sensory specialist at New Belgium. What role does sensory analysis play in the craft beer industry, since you're right in the middle of it?
Yeah, well, my job specifically is really kind of focused on two things, quality assurance and new product development. So quality assurance, kind of first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're putting beer out of the door that is consistent and free of defects and is kind of true to the intention of what we were trying to make. So that's like really the bulk of what we do is make sure that everything from our raw materials all the way to maturation to finished product throughout shelf life, our beer is stable, free of off flavors and what we intended to make. So that's kind of one piece of my job. The other piece is new product development, which is really just focused on understanding what kind of new flavors we can be making from the raw materials that we have. One of the cool things that we do is, given the challenges of working for quite a large brewery, we have to use some of the same raw materials and achieve different flavors. So when we can play around with different malt parameters, or when we can play with different recipes, different ratios of malt in our beers, we can achieve different flavors. So that's partially how I apply malt sensory analysis in the new product development world, to try to vet different malt parameters, the same malt with a little bit higher color, for instance, or different vendors, to see if we can achieve a different flavor with largely the same raw material. So those are kind of the two functions that I have at the brewery, mostly quality assurance and quite a bit of new product development.
And Andrea, you work in you obviously work in a craft malt house, right? What have you been working closely with a lot of the craft breweries to actually develop new malt techniques and new malting methods?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what we bring to the table, I think, is that ability to do small scale research and development with brewers, so that if, we have a thought about how to improve a malt or create a new type of malt, we can have that discussion with a brewer that we already know is a brewer that is looking for new and interesting malts to work with. But we also have brewers that now, through those conversations, come to us and say, hey, can you, just the other day we had one of our customers say, could we work on making a chit wheat malt together? So that's a wheat malt that would be germinated for only about 24 hours instead of 100 to 120 hours. And they're looking for that for a very specific beer that they're working on. And so we're able to pull off, making 500 pounds of that malt, and they're going to do a pilot batch with it and see if it's, going to achieve the kind of beer that they want. So that's the kind of stuff that's really exciting and, is kind of we're the perfect fit for that sort of experimentation.
So, Andrea, the last time I had you on, we were talking about the new ASBC hot steep method, which I think you guys are both heavily involved in. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually is and how you can actually do malt sensory analysis using this hot steep method? Sure.
So that was the bridge to the gap that we talked about earlier, is that we didn't have a method that existed. And I know we've gone into this before the last time that we visited together, but this method is, it's really usable. So there are actually a number of home brewers that use it. The equipment involved and the time involved in learning the method are pretty minimal. So the hot steep method is an ASBC approved method developed in 2016. You basically use 50 grams of malt, you mill it, you add 400 milliliters of water at 65 Celsius, you steep it for 15 minutes and then pour it through a filter, and the liquid that comes out is a wort that is a great medium to be able to evaluate flavor, aroma, mouthfeel. And so that's, what we've been doing at Valley Malt now for about, I guess, almost going on 2 years. And so through this method, we were able to develop our brands. So just like a brewery would, taste a beer that they make on a regular basis and then create a profile of what that beer is supposed to smell like, taste like, that experience, we're able to do that now with our malts. So prior to this hot steep method, we could chew malt, but you're not going to get a real understanding of the flavor and aroma and mouthfeel from chewing malt. So by being able to taste this wort through the hot steep method, we're really able to hone in on what does Valley Malt's pale malt taste like and Pilsner malt taste like. And our entire lineup of malts now we have profiles on, and weekly we're able to evaluate as we're turning out our malts whether or not those malts are true to our brand. So this is something that after being in business for almost 10 years, we're now able to sort of track this parameter of quality at Valley Malt, and that's pretty exciting. And then it's also informing some of the recipe development for brewers that we work with. So we're able to sit down with a brewery, and if they're interested in using one of our chocolate malts, we're able to sit down and taste Valley Malt's chocolate wheat, chocolate rye, chocolate malt, chocolate spelt, chocolate oats. And the brewer is able to taste all those with us there at the table, and that will inform them to develop a recipe around that malt profile. So, it's really opened up a whole world for us of understanding more about what our malts have to offer to brewers. And I will say that one of the ways that has really encouraged us to be able to do this is we started to use an app called Draught Lab, which Lindsay has helped to develop and is really created a great tool for us to be able to use to track all of the sensory that we're doing. So it used to be that we would sit down and we would do sensory every week, and we would write it down in our little individual notebooks, and I never had the time to input that into a spreadsheet. And so this tool has really helped us to be able to track all of the work that we're doing with sensory and quality control.
And I've talked about this to a few homebrew clubs, but I mean, this is a great project for a homebrew club to sit down and actually do this sensory analysis on a variety of malts.
Mm-hmm.
They've, I think it's a great project for them.
Yeah, some of our local homebrew clubs I've gone and done malt sensory with, and they've loved it.
So, Lindsay, as I understand it, you can use this method to get the flavor of any malt, even maybe comparing like base malts, right?
Yes. Yeah. So first of all, I have to say that Andrea is definitely one of our super users of the hot steep method. She really helped develop a lot of this method by just doing a couple little trials here and there. It took nearly a year to develop the hot steep method by just kind of going back and forth and making sure that we could get a repeatable and a sensitive method together that was robust. And so the study that I want to talk about was this kind of like robustness trial that we did with the ASBC. So we basically wanted to know if the method was both repeatable and sensitive. And how we tested repeatability is we just took one batch of base malt, and we had two different technicians at multiple breweries do a hot steep on the base malt. And we did just a simple difference test to see if panelists could tell the difference between technicians using the same base malt. And what we saw from that study was no, panelists could not tell a difference between the same base malt with two different technicians. So that basically told us that it was a repeatable method. The second piece of the study was to see whether or not it was sensitive. So we took two different base malts that were pretty similar to one another. Color was about the same, just different varieties. And we wanted to see if panelists could tell the difference between largely similar base malt using this method and one preparer of the hot steep. And what we found there was that it was indeed sensitive, that most of our panels in the study could tell a difference between two different malts that were largely similar, if that makes sense. So what that told us is that it was sensitive enough to be able to distinguish differences, even small differences between base malts. So we've done quite a few studies just to evaluate the flavor of different varieties, different crop years, different growing regions, different maltsters, all with relatively similar parameters. And base malt flavor is incredibly important. We have
we've really been able to distinguish flavors that are desirable with different malts, and also, on the other hand, flavors that are not so desirable. So at New Belgium, if we are going to get a different crop year, or if we're looking at a new blend or a new vendor, we will definitely do hot steeps, and we can definitely tell the difference between malts, even if they're largely the same analytically.
And is that the same thing you found, Andrea? Can you really tell the difference between a lot of the malts, even from different vendors or different crop years or even different batches? I know you're doing a lot of batches.
Yeah, we do a lot of we do weekly hot steep on our malts just to see if they're true to brand. And our sense is that there are differences between crop years and between varieties, but that they still can fall within a brand of what somebody would expect from a pale malt or a Pilsner malt. I'm not, a real trained panelist in sensory. This is something that I've just kind of, a fake it till you make it kind of a thing, started doing 2 years ago, and just really trying to do it enough that I, become good at it. And Lindsay has been my coach to help me understand some basics on sensory. But I will say that one of the things I notice is protein content can really affect the flavor, especially if you're using a similar malt recipe. If you have a protein content of 9% in a barley, and then you start malting an 11 or 12% protein barley, there are some real significant differences in flavor and aroma.
So, you're saying that protein makes a huge difference here?
At least that's what I noticed at Valley Malt. So if we're sticking to a similar curing temperature for a Pilsner malt, but we're using a higher protein barley, first of all, that Pilsner malt's going to have a higher color because of the higher protein. And along with that higher color, you're going to see more intensity of certain flavors and aromas. Certainly when we started creeping into doing historic malts or barley varieties, and they have really high protein, we started seeing real significant flavor and aroma differences.
Have you been doing a lot of work with heirloom malts and trying to grow heirloom malts?
A little bit, I've been growing out some varieties for 8 years now, and we're at the point now where we have, 5 acres of 3 different landrace varieties, and have started to do some micro malts on those and working with breweries on developing some historic brewing recipes. So, it probably takes up maybe 5% of my time each year, but it is something I'm really passionate about and have a lot of curiosity about.
Very cool. Well, Lindsay, can you tell us a little more about the sensory panels you use and the methods you use to find out that they're statistically significant? Are you guys using like a triangle test or something like that?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. First of all, I did want to add to a little bit of what Andrea was saying. We have done quite a few studies just to scale the various flavors in base malts. And what we try to do is we always try to correlate analytical and sensory data together. And one of the factors that we have seen that drives differences between base malt flavor is protein, in fact, which is not really that surprising, but it's kind of cool to see. Protein really matters. So how we kind of evaluate malts here at the brewery is, first of all, we don't really do what Andrea is doing on a regular basis, which is that quality assurance piece. We kind of push that to our vendors. So the Andreas of the world, we're hoping that they are doing sensory on a regular basis so that they can tell whether or not the base malt that they're getting to us on trucks is within their normal range of variability. And so we basically ask our vendors, what kind of sensory are you doing? Because we know that analytical and sensory largely, there's a lot to be missed there. So we want to make sure that our vendors are doing some kind of sensory so that we are positive that the flavor is going to be largely the same when we're trying to maintain consistency in large brands like Fat Tire. So a lot of that quality assurance piece is pushed to our vendors. So with that said, if we ever have an issue and we need to do some troubleshooting, we will do hot steeps on the base malt that came in. And we always hold at least a pound of the malt that we use for every truckload. And so we make sure that we can go back and troubleshoot if we were to have some kind of an anomaly that is tracked back to the malt. That said, that rarely happens. Our maltsters are really good at what they do. So we typically get very consistent malt. But from time to time, something can happen in transit. For instance, if we'll get a truck that's maybe a little bit higher moisture, and that can have a major impact on beer flavor. And that's something that we would track back. We would see flavors like kind of musty and earthy, kind of moldy flavors that come off from high moisture malt. And that's something that we've seen before. So we'll do kind of troubleshooting that way. And then a lot of the hot steeping that we do is largely around new product development. So again, if we're trying to work with our vendors to get like maybe a little bit of a higher color base malt to see if flavor is going to be boosted or enhanced in a positive way, we'll do hot steeps before we mash in a 200 hectoliter batch. When you're brewing at this scale, it's hard to take risks. We don't really want to take a lot of risks. So we make sure that we do our due diligence as much as possible upstream. And that means, really vetting the raw material in the steep. And we have a really good indication that hot steeping does translate to beer flavor, especially when the beer is very malt forward. So we use the hot steep data just like we would beer data to see whether or not we want to use a new raw material on a large scale.
And that leads right into my next question, Andrea. Of course, you've been looking at this at the beer level as well. Have you found good correlation between the malt sensory panels and the flavors you're getting in the finished beer?
Yeah, so part of our presentation at the CBC, and I think these were slides that Cassie presented. Cassie works for BeerSmith in Wisconsin, was a collaborative research project between, I think it was New Belgium, BeerSmith, and Valley Malt. I'm not sure who else was involved, but trying to see if malts that were preferred in the hot steep. So, you have just a preference of 4 different base malts, 2 from Valley Malt, 2 from BeerSmith. Each set, which one did you prefer? So which one of Valley Malt's Pilsner malts did you prefer? And then BeerSmith made beers from those. And there was a correlation between the beer that was preferred and the malts that were preferred. And Lindsay could probably talk a little bit more about how that whole project was developed and what went into it. But it did in the end show that if you prefer a malt through the hot steep method, you're going to prefer the beer that's brewed from that malt.
And Lindsay, have you found a good correlation between the two, the beer flavor and the sensory panels you're doing on the malts?
Yeah, so this has been kind of a multi-year study. We were really ambitious initially, and what we wanted to do was to see, we looked at, I think, 9 different varieties by 4 different maltsters, and we scaled various attributes in malt, and then we also did that in beer throughout shelf life. And what we wanted to see is there any flavor carryover from malt in those specific flavor attributes to beer, and then do those attributes remain throughout shelf life? And we found some correlations, but it really wasn't that compelling of a story. So when you get really specific, it's hard to see if flavors are transferred from malt to beer. So we took a major step back after looking at that data that was just really complicated and hard to glean any information out of. And we just asked the question, okay, if you have a base malt if you have 2 different base malts and you prefer one over the other, will that preference, just that holistic large preference, translate from malt to beer? And the answer was yes. I mean, the basic design of the study was to get two different malts that were largely the same. Our hypothesis was that there wasn't going to be a significant difference in preference in malt and in beer. And then we got two different malts that we thought would have a large difference in preference. And that's exactly what we saw with those C and D malts. So the samples that we thought would have a large difference, they did have a large difference in preference. And that preference was almost exactly correlated in beer, which was really shocking for us to see. We were very surprised. And in fact, some of that information was captured at the Homebrewers Conference 2 years ago. And what we saw is basically when you have two different malts and one is significantly preferred over the other, that same preference is translated into beer flavors. So that was really a nice indication that while we couldn't really get very specific information to see if specific flavors were translated from malt to beer, we were able to see on a holistic sense that preference in malt does translate to preference in beer.
So the preferences carry over, but not necessarily the flavor 100%, because I guess of all the biotransformations and other things going on during the brewing process. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we're not done with that study. I really do feel that some of the flavors that you get in base malt do translate into beer, but once you ferment it, it really muddies the waters, especially given, different process parameters, different yeast strains, different, you're adding hops, you're doing a lot to kind of muddy the waters, and you're not able to really see those exact flavors carry over. But, in a holistic sense, we do see that largely flavor does carry over. We just don't know exactly what specific attributes are making their way all the way into beer. And I think it's really going to be variable based on fermentation parameters, based on beer style, of course, process parameters. So that was at least a nice indication that base malt flavor does matter, even if we have not been able to specifically see what flavors carry over from malt to beer.
Awesome. Well, Andrea, one huge problem we have with malt sensory analysis is a lack of a lexicon. We don't have the words to describe all the flavors that we're tasting. I understand you guys have been working on something in that regime, right? Andrea? There you go. She's pulling it out. For those of you on video, she's got a big chart here.
Yeah, so this is, again, going back to that Brewers Association white paper in 2014. It was like, music to my ears as somebody who doesn't have the resources as a small malt house to, develop a lexicon for what our malt, what we were tasting and smelling in our malt. To have the industry come together and collaborate to develop what is now called the base malt flavor map has just been amazing. So we have terminology, and again, Lindsay can go into more of what went into developing this. And Lindsay, you have a beautiful head of hair. I'm so surprised that it still exists after all of this. But yeah, just to have, terminology, under the, obviously a lot of base malts, especially when you start getting into pale malts, you have a lot of bready aroma, and to have almost 20 different terms to be able to identify what kind of bready aromas that you're getting is just, it's amazing. And for us to be able to now communicate that to the customers that we work with, and even communicate it to some of the people that are breeding these future varieties of barley and wheat and rye, for all of us to be able to talk about these things in real terms is pretty exciting.
So for the listeners that aren't on the video, can you talk about what that chart is and where people might be able to find it? Who's publishing it?
I'm going to kick that over to Lindsay.
You kick it over to Lindsay, okay.
Yeah.
Is this another ASBC product, or is this something different?
Yeah, it was a collaborative effort with the ASBC. We You can get the base malt flavor map on asbcnet.org, and you can also get it on draughtlab.com. So we, and the digital version is on draughtlab.com as well.
I'd be happy if you send me those links. I'd be happy to include them in the show notes as well, Lindsay.
Sure,
but go ahead.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can do that. Yes. So that study that Andrea was talking about, the second kind of piece, now that we had a method, we really wanted to try to get a language so that we can all communicate from breeder to maltster to farmer to brewer to consumer even. And so what we did with that study is we basically took a whole bunch of different base malts that we thought kind of spanned the range of potential flavor just in base malt alone. We haven't even touched specialty malt yet. We're about to touch specialty malt pretty soon. But what we did is we just looked at the whole span of what base malt flavor could potentially be. We collaborated with, I can't remember everybody, but it was quite a few large breweries, quite a few small breweries, quite a few large maltsters, and quite a few small maltsters. And what we did is we sent them all these samples, had them steep them, and had their panels do what I lovingly call the brain dump, and basically just generate a whole list of terms that they were using. And in order for a term to make it into the base malt flavor map, 2 separate panels needed to mention it at least once. And then what we did is we basically just looked at that proportion data and used the most frequently used terms first, put those first, and got rid of some of just made it consistent. We took all of the pastas and made them pasta, for instance. And we took out some of the vague terms, some of the hedonic terms like pleasant or gross or whatever. We took out all of those. Everything had to be singular, and they had to kind of be largely non-evocative. So we wanted words that were pretty neutral and that were approachable, that everybody was kind of using in the industry. I got on multiple calls with Andrea and Cassie, and we just kind of went through that lexicon to see, okay, well, what does this word mean? Is this redundant? And we took out some of the redundancies, and the result is the base malt flavor map. And now what we're seeing is people are using it to generate their targets. So what Andrea was talking about, using the Draught Lab app, you're able to generate your targets using that lexicon that was developed through that collaborative effort in the ASBC. And it gives us a language to communicate more broadly with one another on base malt flavor, what we're looking for, and maybe what we don't desire as well.
And you kind of broke these things into 3 large categories. I think it's taste, aroma, and mouthfeel. What distinguishes the 3 major categories in your mind?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, in the sensory world, we're concerned with all of our senses. When it comes to flavor, the compilation of flavor is aroma, taste, and mouthfeel. So those are kind of the 3 main parameters that we measure in order to evaluate for consistency and quality. So, you'll see in the base malt flavor map that flavor is kind of the center, and then there are all these offshoots with aroma, taste, and mouthfeel. So they all have different physiological bases. So, taste has a different physiological process than aroma, and mouthfeel, same thing. So they are kind of largely separated from one another, but if you bring them all together, they give you that holistic impression of what flavor is. And we hoped to communicate that in the creative piece of the base malt flavor map. So aroma is obviously the largest category. And then we broke out taste as well, with tastes that are relevant for base malt. So sweetness is obviously in there and is important. And then we broke out mouthfeel parameters as well. So what are you going to get? Are you going to get like there are different levels of astringency, for instance, in base malt. And so we wanted to capture specifically what those terms are as it pertains to malt flavor specifically.
So Andrea, could you go over a few of the aromas you've identified from the malt map?
Sure. And just something I want to point out, we're talking about a malt flavor map and not necessarily a wheel. that was really kind of an intentional thought process, collaborative thought process. And, I think that since we didn't have all of these tools prior to 2016, I think we kind of had a blank slate to be able to really think about how we want to present this information. And I don't know, I really appreciate the way that this map is laid out and the fact that it's not just a wheel. It really seems to make it intuitive to really think about, all the components of flavor, taste, aroma, mouthfeel, and really break it into a way that how we interpret these things in the real world. So I just wanted to point that out because that was something Lindsay brought up in the beginning. We don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We could create something that was a little bit more intuitive, like a map. So I hope everybody has a chance to take a look at it. Whether, and it sounds like you'll provide some links for that.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy. I'll put it in the show notes, of course.
Yeah.
So you want to cover a few of the aromas?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about our Pilsner malt, so one of the things we noticed about Pilsner malt in general is the sweetness on it tends to be, kind of a medium sweetness, tends to be very low in bitterness, low in sour. And in terms of aromas, we tend to get a little bit of hay, grassiness, kind of a honey green tea aroma, and slight breadiness. And so that tends to be our brand for our Pilsner malt and what our brewers would expect from our Pilsner malt. Mm-hmm. There's an example for you.
Awesome.
And on our Valley Malt website now, we have a lot of information about the sensory on our malts, as well as photographs of hot wort. So I had this kind of epiphany a few months back when trying to, just update our website like I try to do every year. And I thought, here I am. I think it happened one day when I was hot steeping some of our malts. And I was like, God, these colors are beautiful. And how do you express to a brewer that our oat malt has this glowing yellow color to it? It's not just a number on the SRM. And so we now have photographs of all of our malts, but then along with it, a photograph of the wort, the color that you're actually going to get from that malt.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Lindsay, can you cover a few of the mouthfeel terms? I thought we'd go through maybe just a couple more from the map here.
Yeah. Astringency, I think, is a really important parameter to be measuring. It's basically just the degree to which the malt has the ability to quench saliva proteins. If you're going to get really technical about it, it's basically how dry does it make your mouth feel? So, and the chemicals that play a role in astringency are tannins, polyphenols, sugars, proteins, acids. So those all kind of play a role in the level of astringency. And you'll see on the base malt flavor map that astringency just basically has the parameters low to high. A very high astringent malt would be something that is really drying to the mouth, and that is a pretty major parameter. It can give you a good idea of the tannins and the level of kind of sugars and proteins and acids in your malt. And we do think that translates into finished product. I think another fun one is, I'm looking at it now, is the amount of how cloying is it? Cloying is basically the level of sticky sweetness that kind of remains on the palate. So
I always think of honey. Honey is a good example of a cloying flavor, right?
Yep. So honey is really sticky. It's really sweet. It's what you would call maybe syrupy. So one of the words that we use on the scale for mouthfeel is basically a low level of cloying, so not very sweet at all, not very thick on the palate, to syrupy, so something that's really kind of thick and coating. And you definitely get various levels of cloying mouthfeel with different malts. So those are kind of two that I like to think about that I think have a major influence on what your beer flavor is going to end up being.
Mm-hmm. And then Andrea, can you go over a couple of the taste terms? I think, aren't these kind of fall into the traditional taste categories, right?
Yeah. Basically on the map here, we have sweet, bitter, sour as the terminology. And when we use our Draught Lab app and we're evaluating a malt, it goes from low, medium to high in each of these categories. And, depending on the type of malt, you would expect, a low sourness to a medium, maybe sometimes a high sourness for something like a kvass or an acid malt. And then with sweetness, it depends on, again, what kind of malt that we're evaluating. But for a lot of our base malts, we're looking for a medium sweetness. And if we're tasting a base malt and it has a low sweetness, we're going to be flagging that that's probably not true to the brand and that there might have been something that happened during modification with that malt. And then with bitterness, that's something that we tend to want probably a low bitterness in most of our base malts. But as we start getting into the roasted malts or high dried malts, that might be more of a medium to a high bitterness.
And Lindsay, have you started to see some of the craft maltsters bring some of the, bring this flavor map into play? Are they starting to publish some of this data?
How we're seeing craft maltsters using it is basically how Andrea is describing, which is kind of multifaceted. First of all, for quality and assurance, to make sure that they are creating the same flavor with each batch, and also just to brewers. I've seen a pretty major shift within the last few years. I mean, a lot of maltsters we're just kind of like, I don't know, you tell us what the flavor is. Like, you're the brewer, I heard that a lot. And now what maltsters are saying is, this is what our malt tastes like. And this is what you can expect to get from our malt. And its flavor is now even starting to become a major parameter that is included on the malt analysis. So traditionally we would get malt analysis and you're going to see SMRT, and you're going to see protein, you're going to see pH, just some of those major parameters. But you're not going to see anything that indicates how the malt tastes. So maltsters are have figured out that it's communicating flavor is actually a really solid selling point. And it helps the brewer say, okay, yeah, you're using, beautiful terminology like, nutty and, alfalfa and that, cereal like, and that gets us excited, and it helps us to determine which ones we want to even move forward on. If it's very rare that we now see any kind of maltster communicating their parameters without using flavor. And that's really only changed in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I was happy to see even some of the big ones, like I think Breeze has started making spider charts, and they publish spider charts for, flavor spider charts for their malts, which is a step in the right direction, I think. Andrea, have you started doing this in any kind of standardized way, presenting the flavor for your malts?
Yeah, it's mostly on our website. And we haven't gotten into doing spider charts, but we have gotten into just listing some of the aromas and flavors that can be expected. And again, color really correlates to flavor in a lot of ways. So showing the color of the malt. But just to comment, I really think that we live in a time where people throughout many industries that are related to food really are caring about flavor, and especially when you're on the smaller craft side of an industry like coffee, wine, beer, bread. People are understanding that talking about flavor and focusing on the differences in flavor are really going to be something that people care about in 2018 and beyond.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm really happy to see that some of the malt houses are starting to publish this data and not just have panels in the back or whatever. And I think it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it says a lot.
Yeah. Well, Lindsay, what role do you think the malt sensory analysis is going to play in the craft beer industry in the future?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, traditionally, historically, barley was being bred for low overall flavor. Adjunct lager has been king and is still king in the brewing world. But now with the craft beer boom, with near over 6,000 breweries in the U.S., a lot of the craft breweries are asking for more flavorful malts. So we're asking breeders to not necessarily breed for lack of flavor. We're asking maltsters to, enhance the barley that they get by malting for interesting and unique flavors. And we're also looking for, in our case, we're looking for flavor stability as well. So I think kind of part of the future is continuing to get unique flavors out of this raw material. And man, the possibilities are endless. Just some of the work of scratching the surface with different varieties, we are seeing differences by variety, by growing region, by maltster. There are so many parameters to play with, and I'm sure, as Andrea can tell you, in the malt house, to make different flavors. So I think that we are going to see some unique attributes coming out of malt in the future. We're hoping for that. And that's something that the BA white paper really highlighted quite well, is basically saying craft brewers are looking for flavorful malts. We're not looking for something that is characterized by their lack of flavor. So I think that's going to be a major step. We're going to continue doing that. And we have a couple of projects going on right now to identify some varieties and identify some parameters that that enhance the flavor that craft brewers want. And we're also hoping to kind of look at malts that are going to give us greater flavor stability as well. We did a study a little while ago just to see what malt varieties provide solid flavor stability. And some of those malts that have been used and really sponsored by the large brewers are pretty stable. So on one hand, we really want flavor, but we also don't want a lot of flavor drift when we actually make it into beer. So I think that's what the focus is going to be on in the next few years.
And Andrea, from the craft maltster's perspective, obviously your business is driving flavor into the malt. Where do you see this going next?
I think it's going to go wherever we want to take it. I think that people are interested in ancient grains. People are interested in heirloom and landrace varieties of grains. People are interested in, sustainability and traceability in varietals. And so I think that, given all of the collaboration and use of technology, the new tools of the hot steep method and the lexicon. I mean, with all of those, putting all of those things together, along with an industry that now has small scale, medium scale, large scale processors, good communication between the value chain. I think that, I can't wait to see where it goes. I can't say exactly where, but I think that it's going to be a blend of all of the things I just listed.
Okay. Well, we're coming up to the end here, but Andrea, I think you wanted to mention there's an upcoming event that you wanted to promote. And also feel free to mention your website as well.
Sure. So our website is valleymalt.com. And we have an updated list of some of the interesting malts that we're working on. I wanted to just let folks know that there is a malt flavor and aroma symposium happening in Minneapolis, June 10th through the 13th. And that's something that's going to, it's just a get together to really focus on some of the stuff that we have been talking about here with you. So for anybody that's, interested in learning more, that's probably a great opportunity.
And is there a website or link or somewhere folks can look that up?
It's listed on the ASBC.
Okay, so it's ASBC.
Yeah.
Great. And then, Lindsay, did you have anything you want to mention about New Belgium or any of the work that you're doing now?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we kind of covered a lot of what we were doing. We have been making some really interesting beers, at least on the pilot scale, using different malts that are unique, and we have a couple of projects kind of in the pipeline to really highlight malt flavor in the near future. So you should definitely keep your eyeballs peeled for beers that highlight malt, and we're going to be talking more about malt flavor in the coming years, and of course we project out many years when we're doing new product development. So that's one thing to definitely be looking for, working with our vendors to make like a little bit different flavors for us. And that's been super fun. So definitely look for some unique flavors coming out of New Belgium. And the other thing to mention, Andrea, of course, mentioned Draught Lab quite a few times. And I really do believe in the tool. It's pretty rockin'.
Can you talk for just a second about what it is, just so folks?
Yeah. Sure. It's a sensory software program, basically, that's created specifically for craft brewers of, kind of small scale. Mm-hmm. We focus both on beer and on malt. And the main kind of functions is to give the users the ability to describe their beer flavor, generate targets, and malt flavor, generate targets, and evaluate for consistency and overall quality, along with there's also a training module. So to do some attribute training, so that the brewing industry is moving forward with utilizing validated sensory panels to evaluate for quality and consistency. It's becoming so much more important now in the brewing world as it becomes more and more competitive to make beers that are unique, that are desirable, and to do that on a consistent basis.
And so this is a phone app, I guess?
Yeah.
And the name of the app again? Is it iPhone, Android, both?
Yep, both. Yeah. Draught Lab, DRAUGHT. Okay. Yeah, the Draught Lab. And yes, again, our website is draughtlab.com. Okay. And there's a free app, and there's also a professional paid app. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty cool tool that we've been developing for the last couple of years, and I'm really proud of it.
Well, thank you. Well, it's great to have you guys both on the show. Really appreciate you being here. I know we had some technical difficulties pulling this off, but thank you, Andrea, for coming on the show again. Great to have you as a guest always.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Brad. It's been great.
And Lindsay, it was nice chatting with you. I haven't met you, but it's nice to meet you over Skype, I guess.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So again, my guests today were Andrea Stanley from Valley Malting and Lindsay Barr from New Belgium Brewing, both experts in sensory and malt analysis. Great to have you guys on the show. Thanks again.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, big thank you to Andrea Stanley and Lindsay Barr for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off when you use the offer code BeerSmith 2018 at beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on the Google Play, iTunes, or Amazon app stores. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.